In the UK, a single-hour episode of TV produced creates 13 metric tons of emissions. The US spends about 5.8 billion metric tons a year, which is an insane amount.
Welcome to the Let's Talk series of Tech in the Arts, the podcast for the Arts Management and Technology Lab. Each month, we review trending stories and topics such as streaming, artificial intelligence, sustainability, social media, inclusion, and much more. Our goal is to exchange ideas, bring awareness, and stay on top of the trends. My name is Victoria Sprouse, the podcast producer, and today I have with me Georgia Calawerts, a contributor to the Arts Management and Technology Lab, to talk about the environmental impact of the film and entertainment industry and how companies in those fields are poised to contribute to the overarching goals of fighting climate change. Georgia, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
The United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26, is finishing up today, November 12th, as we record this. The goal of the summit is to encourage different countries to slow their contributions to climate change, with the specific goal of securing global net zero emissions by mid-century and keeping the global temperature from increasing more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to reach these goals, the United Nations General Assembly has previously set up a series of SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, which are a collection of 17 interlinked global goals designed to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. Many might question the efficacy of the COP26 and the follow-through on promises made there, given the fact that leaders of nearly 200 countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement, but many of those countries have not made sufficient moves to stave off the worst effects of climate change. The United States itself withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement under President Trump, and while President Biden has signed back onto the agreement, some pundits wonder if the U.S. will continue to flip-flop on environmental issues under different administrations that may be elected in the future. While many governments mean well, we can see that if real lasting change is to begin to take hold, it may well be businesses and organizations that have to lead the charge in sustainability efforts. And to not wait for governments to enforce those changes, but to enact them voluntarily for the betterment of society and the future of the planet. So, Georgia, I know that in your work for AMT Lab, you are focusing on a few individual SDGs, one of them being responsible production and consumption, specifically in the world of entertainment. What was the most shocking discovery you made about waste in the entertainment industry, and what steps can organizations take to prevent such waste?
One of the most shocking things I found during my research was the extent of waste production in the film industry. I knew going into my research that this industry produced tons of waste, and I found out from an article from AMT Lab that up to 95% of materials are thrown away after production.
Wow, that's so interesting, because I would assume that companies would want to reuse these materials, if not only for the sake of just cutting down on expenses, like in another production that they have or something like that. So there are 95% goes to waste, you're saying, so there's not a lot of reusing going on in the industry. Why do you think that is?
I think it's because so many shows, it's hard for a show to continue for a long time. Lots of shows are canceled after 1 or 2 seasons. A lot of pilots are shot and then never picked up by anyone. And I think that these sets aren't able to be used for anything else, so they just get rid of them.
Okay, so in particular, maybe like if they built a living room for a TV show and it's really only applicable, or they think it's only applicable to that one TV show, they're not going to save that material if the show doesn't get picked up.
Yes.
Interesting.
One of the easiest and most impactful ways to green a production is to make small changes, and one of the biggest changes is proper food management. On the sets of Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom, they had sets in UK and Hawaii, and they made small changes to reduce the amount of waste produced from the beginning of the production through the end of it. Specifically on the UK set, they were able to donate excess food to shelters in the area. They saved over 145 kilos of food that otherwise would have been thrown out.
And this was during COVID?
Yes. Oh, no, this was in 2017.
Okay. So this was before COVID.
Yes.
Okay.
This is showing practices that have been around for a bit and that movies have started using. And then in Hawaii, the same idea was practiced, but instead of the food being donated to shelters, it was donated to local schools, so all the children got free lunch.
Sounds great to me.
Yes.
I would love to eat like a movie star. Sounds fun. I would love to know what Chris Pratt's having for lunch.
Or the dinosaurs.
Right, or the dinosaurs, yeah.
Other practices that they used on set to reduce waste was reusable water bottles and filling stations, recycling incentives, and lighting was 75% LED, and all the vehicles they used were hybrid.
That's great. And what I like about that is that some of them are more expensive practices, like replacing LED lights and electric cars, which I know over time you recoup that through gas prices, lighting bills, things like that. But some of them are smaller, smaller choices that you make, like sustainable water bottles or filling stations, things like that.
And those make much bigger differences than you would originally think.
Wow. Okay. Yeah.
Which is surprising. Sorry.
No, it's okay. Yeah, it is surprising.
Surprising that more films don't do this.
Right. Yeah, you would think that the amount it costs, I'm just still stuck on this, the whole amount that it would cost a production to buy so many water bottles every single day for like the hundreds or thousands of people on a film set, that it's worth it to them, even from just a profit perspective. Mm-hmm. So I know that single-use plastics are a large concern for many environmentalists, and you were just talking about, reusable water bottles and all this, but the pandemic has made some of those practices harder, especially in the early days of the pandemic when we had less information. Do you think that the pandemic has made it harder for companies to implement reusable practices? Are there any environmental policies you think entertainment companies implemented or lessons that they learned from the pandemic that you think will remain moving forward?
So there's been lots of pros and cons of the pandemic, and I really like looking at the pros and how it has shaped the film industry for the future.
I like that, an optimist.
Yes. One of the biggest things is proper planning from the beginning of the production, of taking that time to think through everything, to have a COVID-safe production, and they're able to sit there and then think of sustainable practices that would save them money in the end.
So if you're already sitting down, with production heads of different departments and you're thinking about ways that you can make a COVID-safe production, why not, we're already here, we're already in the planning stages, let's also think about ways to make the production more sustainable.
Exactly. And they're trying to offset the cost with how much bio-waste they're creating with the COVID tests, the single-use masks, all of that. And by having sustainable practices, they're able to kind of offset that a bit.
I always feel bad when I go to the doctor's office and I see that little pink box that's like medical waste. And I'm like, ugh. Yeah, and I can only imagine on film sets now, in particular, it's so much worse with masks, gloves, and the COVID tests that are required every day.
Yes.
Or almost every day.
In an article from The Hollywood Reporter from 2021, it talks about how COVID has actually helped these sustainable practices. There's even production sites in Canada.
Not what I would have expected.
Neither did I.
Right.
But in Canada, they have actually used compostable PPE, which is something that I don't think many people have talked about or even considered.
I didn't know that even existed.
Yeah, that isn't even a possibility, but it is possible. Throughout the article, it states that they can't rush decisions anymore, which is how they're able to save money and create sustainability.
Right, because before I assume, you think to yourself, you're on a film set, I need a blue shirt. Okay, let me just run over to Target and get a blue shirt. But now it's like, can you leave the film set? If you come back, are you still in a bubble? What's happening? There is much more planning that needs to go into it. So maybe you think, do I really need that blue shirt? And I'm not just talking about a blue shirt. I'm talking about everyday decisions that make up a lot of waste on these film sets.
Yes.
Something that gave me hope for the future of sustainability and entertainment was that during COVID, flights were essentially canceled or discouraged for a brief period of time. And typically, many studios choose to move their production outside of California and film on location because of the large tax incentives many states offer that far outweigh the costs to production companies. However, these companies often do not consider the additional environmental cost of moving an entire production to another state, airfare, shipping, those kinds of things. And so hopefully COVID has incentivized companies to see that, maybe we don't need to fly out an executive for one day on location. Maybe we could just do a Zoom meeting. That's one great way that production companies can increase their sustainability. However, let's talk a little about the environmental impact of a single episode of television. And what are some companies doing to counteract that effect?
So in the UK, a single-hour episode of TV produced creates 13 metric tons of emissions.
Okay, so when you say 13 metric tons of emissions, I am embarrassed to say that I just would have no idea the scale of that. I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I don't even know like what my car emits in a year, and I don't drive my car that often, so I think hopefully it would be less than the average person's car, but kind of help us get a sense of what 13 metric tons of carbon emissions is. Right.
So in total, the U.S. spends about 5.8 billion metric tons a year, which is an insane amount.
Wow, right.
And there's a carbon limit that the world is supposed to not meet every year.
In accord with the
Paris Climate Agreement.
Right. So, yeah, if the U.S. is already at 5.6 billion, we gotta bring that down a little.
And that's just for a 1 hour TV episode. So
imagine the 13 metric tons, right?
So imagine a whole season of a show like Downton Abbey. It has like 20 episodes or something.
So me watching one of my favorite TV shows of all time, I can just now picture, what is it, 13 times 22 metric tons of carbon emissions escaping into the atmosphere as I sit down and aimlessly watch a TV show.
They even equate how much sea ice is lost because of this 13 metric tons, which is around 780,000 square meters. That's for an entire year.
What do you mean that's for an entire year? Like, that's how many?
From UK alone, the amount of emissions they produce is about 20,000 hours of programming, which then equates to 700.
From the UK, like, film industry?
Yes, just them.
Right.
So imagine the U.S., which is huge.
Which, probably has more of a bigger film industry, right?
Sea ice loss is one of the biggest issues with the Paris Climate Agreement because we can't have sea levels rising.
Right. And it's hard to, put that ice back onto the iceberg.
Once it's melted, you can't really get it back.
Right. So given that, what are some companies doing to counteract the effect that, my aimless TV watching has on the environment?
So this is, again, just in the UK. The whole article was about the UK. And
but applicable.
Yes. But every production company is mandated to have a carbon report released every year of how much emissions they use. And it's to help them start thinking about how they can lower these numbers and use more sustainable practices such as renewable energies.
Do you see carbon offsetting as a useful tool or a dangerous trap to fall into?
So the goal isn't to offset, it's to reduce carbon emissions overall in the world. And I think that the goal when you try to offset isn't to reduce emissions. You're just thinking how to be net neutral. And when you're a larger company, you have more money to buy carbon offsets.
So when you say the goal isn't to offset, it's to
lower emissions overall.
What you're talking about, like global goals with the COP26 and the Paris Climate Agreement?
Yeah, so we're going at a rate right now that's going to overshoot the Paris Climate Agreement.
Right, which is the 1.5 degrees of Celsius.
Yes.
I think I have heard that, the 1.5 degrees Celsius might not be the goal anymore, but that even if we surpass that, 1.6 is better than 1.7, is better than 1.8, anything we can do.
And we just can't be offsetting anymore. We need to be drastically reducing how much is being emitted.
Right. So, and the exact difference between carbon offsets and reducing is that with offsets, you're still emitting into the atmosphere, but you are then buying carbon offsets, which pays companies to take that carbon back out of the air, which is kind of a weird cyclical process and not the best.
Spiral.
Yeah, not the best for the environment, probably. Yeah. So to that end, what are the biggest changes you see happening in the entertainment industry that you think could apply across the board at big and small organizations that would make a real difference in their environmental impact and that would actually allow them to brand themselves as a more sustainable business?
I think some of the biggest changes that need to become more standardized is proper planning. The more I read, the more it is about planning and thinking about how they can be sustainable while saving money. And sustainability does save companies tons of money. But since the entertainment industry is such a fast-paced industry, they don't normally have that time to sit back and think about their decisions. They just go, go, go.
So COVID has kind of given them that time to sit back and think about their decisions, and we're hoping that they will carry that with them going forward.
Yes, and
that's the goal.
There were so many case studies before the pandemic that showcase these sustainability practices, including Jurassic World, Call of the Wild by Disney. And it shows that proper planning can really go a long way in these productions. I also think that looking at climate change as a group project instead of as just individual companies doing different things is really important.
Right. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier about how you can look at other companies and see what they're doing. So maybe taking the practices from the UK, which you were saying requires
carbon reporting
by film companies, and maybe implementing that here in the US, or even if it's not implemented, businesses just willingly doing that in order to work together to decrease emissions in the film industry overall.
Yes. And collaborating is just not something that happens a lot with competitors in the film industry. They are very cutthroat about the products they're producing and the different movies and the movie rights and everything. But I think if they're able to share resources and work to the same goal of having a sustainable world, then they'll be able to create more content for everyone.
And I can feel less bad about aimlessly watching Netflix then if I know that Netflix is working towards being a sustainable company.
Exactly.
Right.
They actually have the most rigorous sustainability plan in place to be net zero by the end of 2022.
Wow.
And are actively working to take carbon out of the air. Atmosphere.
So net zero, not just buying carbon offsets,
yes.
Right. Well, I think you've certainly given us a lot to think about and some actionable steps to be taken. Georgia, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the AMT Lab podcast, and don't forget to subscribe wherever podcasts are found. Let us know what you thought by visiting our website, amt-lab.org. That's amt-lab.org. Or you can email us at amtlabcmu@gmail.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at Tech in the Arts, or on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Arts Management and Technology Lab. Join us next time for an interview episode with Quincy Brown about PR and marketing in theater. Thanks again for listening. If you found this episode informative, educational, or inspirational, then send this to another arts aficionado in your life. We'll see you next time.